An important new report from Pew Research claims that in the pandemic, India's middle class has shrunk and that poverty has spread. In contrast, China has seen considerably smaller changes. Now, given that India and China account for more than a third of the global population, with about 1.4 billion people each, the course of the pandemic will have a huge effect on changes in the global distribution of income. That's what the report says. But there's a lot in it for India, and what it does suggest is quite worrying. Significantly, India is estimated to have seen a greater decrease in the middle class and a much sharper rise in poverty than China during the COVID-19 downturn. Now, this is in line with the World Bank revised growth estimates, which in January revised India's growth downwards to minus 9.6%, but forecast 2% growth for China. But let's focus more on India and how the pandemic may have driven 75 million below the poverty line. That number is huge. Now, according to, and this is just in 2020, according to Pew Research Center's report, the pandemic may have shrunk India's middle class population by a whopping 32 million as the pandemic led to massive job losses. Before the pandemic, it was anticipated that 99 million people in India would belong in the global middle class in 2020. But post-pandemic, this number is estimated to be 66 million, cut by a third, as India plunged into its deepest recession in more than 40 years. In comparison to India, China fared much better. In China, the number of people in the middle income tier decreased by only 10 million. The report is based on an analysis of World Bank data. Well, we've got a superb guest joining us now. It's always a pleasure to interview Professor Abhijit Banerjee, the Nobel laureate. Thank you very much, Professor Banerjee, for being with us. You've had a chance to go through this report. Firstly, the methodology, as I understand it, refers a great deal to, or is based a great deal on, purchasing power parity. Therefore, the numbers are fairly useful, would you agree, in making this assessment of consumption? I just want to understand the methodology.
Yeah, I guess I'm less I'm going to be less charitable to these numbers, I'm afraid. And I think that I do want to make a point there, which is that I think that in somewhere in the small print it tells you that this is all based on assuming that every section of India's population, the poor, the middle class, the rich, the ultra rich, their incomes grew at the same rate. That seems such an implausible starting point. I mean, so I think these numbers, they're not useless, but they are a bit of just a starting point. And I would say probably, given everything else we know, the fact that, we were producing 1 billionaire a week, I believe, during the same year, 2020, I suspect that means a lot more bad news at the low end. I mean, if just to parse that, if the total pie is all they're basing on is the total pie shrunk by 8.6%, then assume that everybody's income grew at the same negative rate, then you would get these numbers. To me, this means that since everybody's income didn't grow at the same rate, in particular the poor, the income of the rich seems to have ballooned, it must be that the income of the poor fell by much more. I think there's more bad news than this report is disclosing.
But Professor Banerjee, the numbers over here are also huge. The pandemic may have driven 75 million below the poverty line in 2020, is what they're saying. India's middle class population by a whopping 32 million. These numbers are staggering by itself. So the question is this: if this is actually the number, and you suggest that it could be much more, until this is fixed and those who have gone into the poverty level actually come back into lower middle incomes, when will we actually see decent growth in our economy?
I think that the growth question is, in a sense, depends very much on what policies are pursued and what happens now. I think that this is largely a reflection of the fact that the labor markets collapsed and therefore people had no earnings. Now, if the economy has recovered to some extent, it's slow, the recovery, but I think it's slow partly because we still don't have the kind of demand stimulus that we've been arguing for a long time. I think the economy has I think the government has moved in that direction. That there is more and more emphasis on demand, but I still think that the demand in the economy with this kind of a shock, especially the consuming class got clobbered. You would imagine that that's where there's still a demand shortage. We don't see any investment recovery. That's been pointed out by multiple experts that the investment recovery has been slow, and that's not a surprise. I mean, I wouldn't invest in production if it is the case that the market is shrunk.
Professor Banerjee, it's sometimes we get lost in numbers. But just the quality of lives of millions of Indians, which has plummeted during the pandemic, is something which we should perhaps look at. Now, this report says, and I quote, before the pandemic, it was anticipated that 99 million people in India would belong in the global middle class in 2020. A lot of these individuals would have aspired to belong to the global middle class, and they would have achieved that under normal circumstances. But post-pandemic, the number is estimated to be 66 million, cut by a third. They've all fallen back considerably. So the quality of life of millions of Indians is now indefinitely on hold. Would you agree?
I hope not. I mean, I think it depends exactly as I said. It's not that we are in some irrecoverable abyss. It's a matter of the right policies if demand recovers. It's not that there's something that's happened that changes the nature of the entrepreneurial spirits in India, the ability of the workforce to produce. So I'm still optimistic. I just think that we need good policies and real force behind those good policies, and then I still think that we are capable of growing fast. I just think that we should not take this as our sort of God-given gift that we will grow at these rates. I think we were growing because we had a bunch of good factors going our way. If we take them away, we won't grow.
Okay. Professor Banerjee, why has China, according to this report, fared much better than India during this pandemic?
That's the interesting part. The interesting part is China. China is really the global outlier. And, what they did with the pandemic, they did things that I don't think we could have done. I think there's a sense in which being an authoritarian state allows them to do certain things that we would not have been able to do. So they control the pandemic. I think there is some doubts about Chinese data, but I think given everything else, I think everybody thinks that Chinese did control the pandemic much more effectively and quickly than we did. They controlled it very quickly. As a result, they didn't really have the kind of economic losses we had. I mean, right now, all the news we have is almost that the GDP of China went up and ours went down. And that's really, and everything else is this Pew report is a bit of putting a gloss on that fact. But it's really that, which is that the Chinese manage, and that's true not just relative to us, it's relative to the US, relative to Europe. The Chinese really were a spectacular outlier. Whatever they did to control the pandemic meant that the economy really restarted very, very fast.
One final question. Now, this report says India cut poverty sharply from 2011 to 2019. Now, that is correct. But at the same period, China greatly boosted its middle and upper middle class income populations. Therefore, whatever impact COVID has had on China's economy and its people, a large number, millions, were already one tier higher in terms of income than India. So, therefore, in terms of their quality of life or their income, it's gone down, but not as much as India, where our people were poorer in a sense to begin with.
Yes, and indeed, we think that we don't actually know how much poorer, because one of the problems we've had is that since 2016, we've just basically stopped the production of domestic data. We don't, the NSS or various rounds have been rejected by the government. So to the extent that we see any data, in fact, we see some evidence of an increasing poverty after 2016. That data was shown briefly and then removed and said that there's a claim that the data is wrong. But I would like to see data. I think without data, we can't really have these conversations. That's part of the problem. I don't want to say that it's malafide, but I do want to say that we can't have these conversations in air. We're right now having it in air because we don't know what would have happened in 2019, given that we don't have any data really. telling us what's happening between 2016 and 2019. I think we really should be, that should be the big message. The big message is we need some real numbers to figure out where we are and what to do.
All right, Professor Banerjee, thank you so much for speaking to us and running us through this report and your thoughts on it. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.